So I'd like to reintroduce Dr. Aleisha Swartz, who's going to talk about a feline influenza outbreak in New York City. You might have read about this in the news, but she's going to talk us through it now. Thank you.
All right, you guys are hanging in there for Friday, and I appreciate your diligence in sitting through all these sessions. They've been so great, though. And I'm excited to tell you, I feel like this talk is a little bit about how I spent my summer vacation, although it wasn't exactly vacation. It was January, it's your summer, it was really our winter. It's quite cold in New York City. But I spent the better part of January in New York dealing with this new influenza infection in cats. And I think for a lot of you may look at the program and go, well, that doesn't really apply to me. We don't have influenza. We definitely don't have influenza in cats. But I think there's actually a lot of lessons from this outbreak and a lot of things that we've worked with the shelter afterwards that are good take-home lessons. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of how does this relate to you, even though you may not see influenza yourself. This was not something that the UW program did on their own. We had an immense number of partners that helped us get through this and helped the shelter in New York City get through this and help save the lives of many, many cats. We work extensively with our veterinary diagnostic lab at the university that did hundreds and hundreds of tests every day for us for several months. The shelter in New York City did an amazing amount of work and has continued to do an amazing amount of work. You don't ever wish an outbreak on any shelter, but what you hope is in the event that it happens, that you use it as a learning opportunity to change and improve and grow, and they have really just exceeded our expectations. The ASPCA stepped in and helped us quarantine cats who were exposed and infected with feline influenza, and that really made a difference in order to be able to save lives. And Maddies Fund stepped in when we asked and we needed someone to help cover the costs. And truly we had no idea what we were getting into when it started, and we cannot thank them enough. We could not have done it without them. But the list goes on. There were a lot of people involved in this, and I think one of the really remarkable things out of this is it was a one-of-its-kind opportunity to pull all of these people together to make this happen. This was an unprecedented event, and it really does take that whole village. It took all of these people involved, including our interns spent their whole Christmas breaks in New York City, going into the shelter, working every single day. Our team was occupied for months with this outbreak and helping these cats, and so all of these people really just gave so much to help these cats. So you may say, and I have the same thing because I live in Hawaii and I don't have influenza in Hawaii. There is not influenza in dogs and cats here from what I hear. You guys call cat respiratory infections cat flu. That throws me off a little bit, but influenza itself I don't believe is here. And the thing was, I'll tell you, is it wasn't in the US either when I got out of school in 2002. There was no such thing as canine influenza in the United States. And back in 2004 in Florida, dogs were getting ill. And further testing realized that an equine influenza had started developing the ability to infect dogs, and then it could spread from dog to dog. So that was H3N8. Influenzas come in different strains, as you may know from the human side. We worry about pandemics of flu, and we also do things like flu vaccinations that change every year. That's why you need to get a new one every year. And so influenza, most of the influenza I'm going to talk about today, or all of the influenza I'll talk about today, is influenza A. And influenza A's are named with these H and N numbers, and those are the subtypes. And so the first canine influenza in the United States, and it didn't happen before 2004, it was H3N8. And H3N8 it happened in my practice time, but I really never saw it as a veterinarian in practice. It sheds for a very short period of time. It would happen in small little outbreaks, and then you wouldn't see it very much. So the vaccine came out, but it wasn't really widely used, and you would just see little pockets here and there, but not much. But things for us in the US changed dramatically in 2015. Dogs in Chicago started getting sick with respiratory infections. And we're starting with canine influenza because it's good to lay the groundwork of what we know about influenza in dogs and cats in the US before this started this past winter. And so the first cases in Chicago were actually in owned dogs. So it didn't start in the shelter. The shelters were unaffected. Testing was being done by veterinarians out in the community, and it was coming back negative for influenza. And we know that it was coming back negative for influenza because they were looking for H3N8. So they're only looking for the one type. And it's something to know when you run diagnostic testing, to know what you're testing for, what your testing tells you. And so what their testing was telling them was that there was no H3N8 there, but it wasn't telling them there was no flu there was no influenza there. And this was something that at first spread through, we kind of called it a wealthy dog disease. So it spread in dogs going to doggy daycares and boarding facilities and veterinary clinics and that kind of thing. And then eventually it did end up in the shelter, because as a shelter, when you take in animals, infectious disease will show up. And unfortunately, we never really had the opportunity, because of the lag in figuring out that it was H3N2, we never were able to get in front of it. And that's what you want to do with an outbreak, is you want to get in front of it so you can stop it. And even now, Chicago continues to struggle. Across the US, there'll be little pockets. This summer, there was some pockets of influenza as dogs travel throughout the country and people take their dog from one area to another. But it isn't something that's in general widespread all over. There is an ongoing mapping, so Cornell maintains a map of all the reported cases that have been diagnosed. And there haven't been cases of H3N2 that we were aware of in New York City. So it's not something that was present in their shelter system, where we do see it still in Chicago from time to time. And what happened with H3N2 influenza in shelters when it did make it in is this. So when you look at that chart on the left side, there's your left side, the light green, which you may or may not be able to see, but you can probably see the yellow, is the first day. The yellow is the infected dog. So the first day, you see one infected dog. And then in a very short time, you go to a lot of infected dogs. And really quickly, you have all the dogs in your shelter infected. They're all coughing. We're talking about shelters with 200 plus dogs that are all sick. So although probably most of you have dealt with respiratory infections in dogs and cats, you're probably not used to seeing everybody in the shelter get sick. It's because they don't have any natural immunity to influenza, and so it spreads like a tidal wave. That's what we call it, where it just literally changes before your eyes and everybody's ill. So when this happened, we're doing quite a bit of work in these shelters, and we're looking at the cats in the shelters with H3N2. And we're looking at the cats because we had seen that there were some reports in Korea, and I believe that it's published now, that there were some antibody levels measured in cats. So the dogs were affected, they measured antibody levels, blood levels in cats, and saw that they had been infected, developed an immune response, and the antibody levels told them that. And there was one shelter that reported infection in cats. And so we're worried. We didn't want cats to have a new disease. That's the last thing cats need, is a new disease. So we screened and tested, and despite being in shelters where you have hundreds of dogs infected, we weren't seeing cats infected with H3N2 during this outbreak in 2015. And then one veterinarian called us from a shelter in Indiana, a small shelter, and she was worried about her dogs. And indeed went into the shelter and tested all the dogs in the shelter, and they all had influenza. So the shelter had pretty widespread influenza in their dogs. And then, as became the practice, was ask about the cats. How are your cats doing? In general, the cats are doing pretty well, but there was one room of cats that were sick. And that one room had 9 cats in the ward, and the cats were drooling, which isn't something we see a lot with respiratory disease with cats. They might be drooling if they have an ulcer in their mouth. But these cats were drooling, and that seemed weird to have one room of a lot of drooling cats. And so we tested those cats, and those cats did come back to be positive. 8 out of the 9. So there was one shy cat in the upper corner cage who's maybe not as interactive with people. We really don't know why that cat didn't get infected. But we tested that cat repeatedly, and he was never infected. And we tested the rest of the cats repeatedly, and they were infected. We saw the shedding was about 10 to 12 days. And in that shelter, all of the dogs were infected, but not all of the cats. So one thing that we had learned from H3N2 is despite lots of opportunities for exposure, lots of opportunities in all of these shelters where their dogs are all sick, they're not all so perfect that their cats weren't potentially exposed, but it just really didn't seem like it was high risk for these cats to become sick. It was something that we felt like was pretty uncommon. We don't know how to explain these 8 cats that did get sick. We do suspect that they probably spread it to one another, But we don't know how. We just don't have the answers. But we do feel pretty comfortable that it's not a high risk. It's definitely yet another reason to separate your cats and your dogs amongst all the other reasons, but not a high risk situation. So now you kind of know the context where we were in November before we get a phone call from the Animal Care Centers of New York City. So this is a large open admission shelter. They're a nonprofit with a contract to run the shelters for the city of New York. The city of New York, they serve over 8 million people. It's a lot of people for one shelter system to handle all of their stray animals and owner surrenders and legal cases. They have 3 full-service shelters that serve as intake centers as well as adoption centers, and most of their animals have a positive outcome through rescue. So rescue is a large way of how animals get out of that shelter, and they have a really high live release rate for such a large shelter. They take in about 30,000 animals a year, and 19,000 of those are cats. So to give you kind of a scope of how large this shelter system is. And there's 5 shelters, 2 admission centers, 3 full service, and they're spread out. So although New York City doesn't look very big on a map, it can take you more than an hour to get from one shelter to another. It can be really challenging. They take in all animals, and one of their facilities is open 24 hours a day. So there's a lot going on. This is a busy place. They have a lot of staff. They have a lot of veterinarians. So Mimi was a cat who came into animal care centers in New York City, and she was a 12-year-old owner surrender cat, and she became ill, and she became severely ill, and she was euthanized on November 25th. And before she passed away, they had pulled some samples because her illness was more severe than what they would normally see. So as any other shelter, they see some respiratory infections in cats, but this illness was more severe than typical. And Mimi's test sample to the lab was accidentally marked that she was a dog. And so because that sample was accidentally marked that she was a dog, they tested her for H3N2, and it came back positive. And so their veterinarian, who had been on her job for 3 weeks, called us and said, "Oh my goodness, I have a flu positive, an influenza positive on this cat who passed away." And this is right around Thanksgiving time, because apparently all these things always happen around major holidays and during busiest times of year. And so then, now, the thing is what questions do we want to ask? We know some about influenza in dogs, and we know a little bit about influenza in cats, and we know about H3N2. And what are some things that we want to ask? We might want to ask, do you have sick dogs in your shelter? One thing that we know with canine influenza is all ages of dogs are affected. They most likely don't have any natural immunity, so it affects puppies as well as adults, any age. Vaccination history typically doesn't matter very much. A lot of dogs aren't vaccinated for canine influenza, although there is a vaccine. We want to know if there are other species in the shelter and are they affected. We want to know how many cats are sick. So is this just this one cat got more sick, or is this something where all the cats are sick? And how sick are the cats and the dogs? And we want to know what kind of testing was done. So we know that IDEXX does testing that's very specific for H3N2 and H3N8, but we want to know a little bit more about that testing. It's hard as a veterinarian when you don't do tests really commonly and you get back a report of a test you may not do very often. Sometimes it can be difficult to interpret, and we work with shelters all the time about it, but if you ever have questions, make sure you call your lab or call your university. Ask them for help if you don't know how to interpret things. And then we want to know if there's further testing possible. And I brought this up because it came up at the Parvo talk as well. If you ever have an animal die in your care that seems to be unusual circumstances, make sure you take advantage of that opportunity to find out more in the event you're on the tip of the iceberg like we were here. So when we talked to Dr. Brennan, she said, well, there's some sick dogs in the shelter. And that's exactly what she said. There's some sick dogs. They're not all sick, but I have some sick dogs. Well, a lot of shelters have some sick dogs. There's a lot of sick cats in the shelter. Well, okay, that may or may not be significant, but there's a number of sick cats in the shelter. We knew, as I said, that IDEXX was doing testing on dog samples, specifically looking for H3N2 and H3N8. But as we learned in the Chicago outbreak, If there was another kind of influenza, those specific tests, while they might be very good for those particulars, may not tell us about more influenza types. So we might want to ask more questions and look a little further. We knew that her submission sheet was marked as a dog, which ultimately ended up helping us. And then, fortunately, we still had her remains so that we could do some further testing. When you're in veterinary school, one thing that's commonly told to you pretty much from day one is when you hear hoofbeats, don't think zebras. So when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Horses are much more common than zebras. But something in New York City wasn't making sense. It didn't fit. It didn't fit that Mimi would be H3N2 infected and not have any dogs in the shelter infected. Stuff was not making sense. This was a 12-year-old cat who had a good vaccination history, had been on owner surrender, had been in good health, and became all of a sudden suddenly ill. So something was going on. Something abnormal was going on. And we need to start looking further. And just in case you didn't remember, it's a city of 8 million people who takes in 19,000 cats a year. And the cats are leaving every day. So there's some urgency to find out what's going on. So we were able to start doing some sampling on other cats and dogs in the shelter. And we also sampled rabbits. And at our Wisconsin lab, we do something that's called broad-based testing for influenza A. So it's a little bit of a wider net. It will catch more. It's not quite as specific as those two. And then that was positive. Some of those samples were positive. And so then we started looking further to see, is this really H3N2? Because the dogs weren't positive and the rabbits weren't positive. So that didn't make sense that it would be H3N2. It wouldn't make any sense that the dogs wouldn't be sick in the shelter. This shelter was at capacity. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But if it was affecting the cats, we would likely see it in their dogs. So our Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab has an amazing virologist who was able to do some typing and found H7. So a totally different subtype that all of a sudden increased the whole thing because H7 is reportable because of the risk to agriculture. So H7 is an avian influenza. And I happened to look up, the meat and poultry industry in the US makes up about 5% of our economy. So all of a sudden, things got a lot more serious. And so the good news is that when we reported it to the US Department of Agriculture, they were really helpful and they helped us really quickly sequence and type it. And we're able to identify that this is H7N2, low pathogenicity avian influenza. So that's a big mouthful. I learned all about avian influenza that I had no idea. It's very complicated. And there were a few things about this particular strain. So one is that we knew that it circulated in the live bird markets from 2000 to 2006. But they had done extensive surveillance testing in the live bird markets, and we haven't seen it for 10 years. So how is this cat in a shelter ending up with H7N2 when it has not been seen in the country for 10 years? And we're still not quite sure the answer to that. But that makes everybody a little bit worried. So we always get a little bit nervous when influenza starts doing weird things, when it starts infecting species that we don't expect, when it starts showing up in places where we didn't know it was, where we've been looking and we haven't found it. So then our next step in investigating this outbreak is to look back and look a little bit more at Mimi. So again, as I said, Mimi was 12 years old. She was surrendered by her owner. I believe the reason was she was moving. There had been 2 cats in the home. She had been able to rehome one of the cats, but Mimi, she couldn't, and she turned her into the shelter. And on the 14th, Mimi had mild ocular discharge when we looked at her records. So thank goodness, this is another reason to keep good records. So we look back and we see she had mild ocular discharge. And they treated her and she improved. And we don't know, and we won't know, there wasn't testing done at that point in time. Was that influenza? Or was it herpes? Because she was stressed. She was a 12-year-old cat coming into a shelter that had a lot of cats. But on the 23rd, she developed some respiratory problems. And then she got worse very quickly, and due to humane reasons was euthanized because she was declining so quickly. And I think this is a good lesson right here of when do you do diagnostic testing? Because it's something that shelters underutilize a lot, is when you have animals who get much more sick than you expect, or more animals getting sick, it's a good time to decide to do diagnostics. even if you just pull samples and hold them for a little bit. Depending on the samples, for flu, that's not a great thing because the samples don't last very long. But we are very thankful that we had these samples. It really helped us get ahead of this, as opposed to in Chicago with H3N2, where we were chasing it, and we just have never been able to catch up. And it will be really hard to eradicate that virus. So, Dr. Brennan called us after she got her samples back. It had come back H3N2. And another quick word of caution is diagnostic testing is not as perfect as we want it to be. We want those tests, those snap tests, the dots or the numbers, we want them all to be perfect, and they're not perfect. So when something doesn't make sense, you look further, and you want to look at diagnostic testing in the whole picture. So the clinical picture, what else is going on in the shelter? That's why we ask all those questions. And repeat tests and check other animals. Those are things that are really important. We don't just look at one test and move on. It's a good lesson for all of us to learn. So then the next step, because at this point in time, they were having animals leaving every day, and we needed to figure out what's going on. We need to figure out what the risk is. Is there risk to agriculture? Is there risk to the public at large, cat owners, et cetera? And so our team went out to New York City to help them, because the hardest part when you're in the middle of a disease outbreak is having enough hands to do all these things. And so this is where our interns spent their Christmas break, swabbing cats every day. They had more than 500 cats in their system at that time, and we needed to test everybody and figure out where they were. They have 2 shelters that are quite large and 1 shelter that was pretty small. And what we saw through our testing is that the wave was moving through pretty quickly, kind of like that tidal wave with the dogs. And the good news is other species were consistently testing negative. So we weren't finding it in anybody else but the cats, and that's good. We basically developed a task force on the spot and had regular phone calls with the shelter in New York City, the USDA, the state veterinarian in New York, public health departments, the CDC was involved, and Maddies Fund as well. Trying to all figure out, define what's going on, what our problem is, and then what are we going to do about it. And I must say that Dr. Newberry deserves an enormous amount of credit because she saw what was coming. So what would happen if you have H7N2 in a poultry house is you would depopulate. You would depopulate all the birds, and we're talking about 500 cats. And we have this picture up here because all you had to do was work for a couple of days in the shelter. This little kitty was in the quarantine facility, and he was in a pen with Huckleberry, Blueberry, Banana, and Hannah. And these are individuals, and we thought there was a better way. There's a better way than just depopulating. These are some fabulous, amazing cats, and we really wanted to see if we could have a different way to have a good outcome. And so Dr. Newberry saw what was coming and made a phone call to Maddies Fund and said, hey, if they talk about depopulating the shelter, can I offer a quarantine? I have no idea how much it's going to cost. I have no idea how long it's going to take. I can't give you any of those answers, but I want to take a chance. We want to see if we can show people a better way to handle this. And so it did come up, and Maddies had said yes. And so we were able to bring up, well, what if we quarantine them? And the good news is they had faith in this amazing veterinarian that she was going to be responsible and that we're going to do the right thing, and we were going to do this the right way and safely, and hopefully stop a disease of cats while at the same time giving the best chance we can to this adorable little cat named Huckleberry, because he was so stinking cute. And he really deserved a chance. Through no fault of his own, he happened to come into a shelter at a time when a really rare disease happened to walk through its door. We had no idea when we got into this the potential cost. We knew we'd have to do quite a bit of diagnostic testing, not to mention quarantining, and we hadn't even decided at that point what quarantine meant and how long. We didn't know. We know that H3N8 influenza in dogs sheds for about a week, so it's really short and it can move on, and that's probably why it hasn't continued to persist as much. But H3N2 sheds for a number of weeks. It can shed for a long time, and that makes things more challenging. We knew that this could cause a lot of panic. So in a city like New York, that large, and influenza's doing weird things, we didn't want people, the public, and people to panic. We also knew that animals were leaving all the time, and we wanted to be able to track them down and know that this was spreading. We didn't want it to spread. The state was involved, and we are all doing our best efforts to make sure this doesn't get out into the community at large. And Maddies Fund also offered testing for adopters and rescues who'd taken cats home, so we knew if they were positive. It was really generous. We had free diagnostics. And then along the way, two other things happened. So one is cat respiratory disease happens. So cat flu happens on top of cat influenza. And so that kind of makes things confounding. How much of a role is influenza playing here? And then we were thankful that the ASPCA, who has headquarters in New York City and works closely with the animal care centers in New York, was able to step in, and this is something that they do, is set up temporary shelters, and they were able and willing to come in and set up a quarantine facility. So the concern when avian influenza start doing weird things is, one big concern is human health. So in the literature, there were 2 people previously infected with H7N2. I think one was in New York City, probably around that, a little more than 10 years ago. And so the public health department got involved and started testing lots of exposed people, cat adopters, shelter workers, everybody who's been involved with these cats, and tested over 350 people. There was one veterinarian who'd been handling cats very closely and extensively, doing testing, was weak positive for 1 day. It was a kind of crazy 1 day, but she tested negative immediately after that. But that certainly changed things quite a bit as well. Is now we're talking about, this is Dr. Newberry, and this is pretty much how I spent my January, was head to toe covered, double gloves, booties, fully zipped up, but this really changes things. This changes the expense, can you imagine the challenge of trying to work with cats like this, dressed like this, cats who are scared already, and now you're coming at them looking like a spacesuit, not to mention it's extremely uncomfortable, and I definitely did my share of whining and complaining wearing this outfit for days on end. And I just feel bad for the cats. All of your normal things you do to help, set them at ease are a little bit awry when you're dressed like this. But we wanted to make sure we didn't have other people infected. The last thing that cats need is more people to become sick. And the good news is that was all that we knew of the human side. It was 1 week positive, 1 day. So we knew we had to be careful, but there was also extensive exposure that didn't end up to be anything else, thank goodness. So going back again into ACC's records, we wanted to look back and see, was there anybody else before Mimi who might be suspicious? And we found a little kitten named Alfred. And the photo is probably not very great because that's his intake photo and that's all we had. But we saw he went into the shelter on the 26th of October. He was a stray found in somebody's yard. He was neutered and adopted pretty quickly, so that's great. But then he became sick on November 4th. And then he went to an emergency clinic. He became severely ill and he passed away. The day that he passed away was the day that Mimi came into the shelter. And we suspect that Alfred was potentially the first case, but we don't know because we didn't have his remains available for testing. We don't know if Mimi and Alfred's paths crossed in any way, and we don't know if there was another cat who maybe was exposed to both of them. These were questions we're not sure of, but this is not a typical situation for this shelter. So when we look at this case, it makes us wonder. And we don't know until that testing was done, you have no idea what's going on. So we had Mimi come in and Mimi became sick and that's where we were able to start figuring out what's going on. There were 2 other shelters that had positive cases in New York. They were both shelters that pulled animals from animal care center. So they took transfers and we didn't find any other cats that were outside of the animal care and control system. All of the cats had been through the animal care and control system. We did find some cats in private homes and cats in rescues, but everybody could be linked back to being in the New York City Animal Care Center shelters. So now we have to set up a quarantine. We've got a new novel virus that's infecting cats. It seems to be spreading through the cats. And so we need to set up a quarantine facility for over 500 cats and do it fast and hurry up. Oh, and by the way, it's Christmas. So the ASPCA was amazing and in a matter of days came in and set up a quarantine facility. Because of the potential for human exposure, it was decided it was not a possibility to keep the cats in the shelter and set up a new facility for new intakes. We decided to move all of the cats to the quarantine facility. So we had to move cats from 3 different shelters, all spread out through New York City, which isn't an easy place to drive around in, and quarantine them and house them and get set up when we didn't know how long it was going to be. We had no way to know. What kind of PPE do we need for the people to protect them and protect the cats? There was a lot of unknown questions at this time, but everybody came together and made it happen in between Christmas and New Year's. So it was really, truly an amazing, amazing effort. And what happened? So I left home on January 2nd thinking, okay, it's my turn to do my shift and help with this. And I thought I was leaving for 10 days, and I didn't come home for 4 weeks. I swabbed hundreds of cats every day while wearing all of this PPE, and our lab ran hundreds of samples every day. It was truly amazing effort. And by doing that, what we were able to do is document cats who are negative, became sick, and then cleared. And that enabled us to tell when cats were safe to be released and no longer a risk. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to make sure, our goal was to not have a new disease of cats. Cats do not need another respiratory disease. They don't need another disease. We have enough with the ones we have already. Some cats were negative through the whole time. And what we weren't sure was, were they never exposed and never infected, or were they exposed and they were cleared before we came on the scene? And so we were able to send blood samples to Cornell University, who looked for antibodies and was able to see some of those cats had been previously infected. The good news is that we had no new cases or positive tests after February 5th, 2017. The vast majority of cats recovered. So it can cause some more severe disease in terms of clinical signs. The drooling was something we did see in New York City as well. But in general, it could be hard to distinguish from the average person from a cat respiratory infection caused by something else. And so we were really fortunate and we were really excited. And that's why I went home like January 30th and February 5th. We were almost at the end. I just couldn't leave until I felt like we were almost through it. And the question is, did we win? You know, this was an enormous endeavor that took an enormous amount of resources, both people, time, sweat, tears, money, all kinds of things. But we really do feel like we won. We did something that hadn't been done before. We were able to stop at this point, unlike what we couldn't do in Chicago. At this point, we haven't found H7N2 in cats anywhere else. So really exciting to be able to put a stop to that. It was definitely worth it for that alone and to give a chance to all those cats. Only time's going to tell. Influenza viruses we feel like in the US now, are something we're watching for. We're constantly checking. We're being more vigilant. And I would say even if you don't have it here, it's something to be thinking about. Keep it in your mind. It's something we didn't have before, and now we do. So, and one thing that I will say is, and I may say it later again, but while I was at quarantine, testing all these cats every day and helping oversee their medical care, the ASPCA had an enormous team of volunteers and staff and everything caring for all these cats, because not only do you set up a large temporary shelter, but you're also setting up a large temporary shelter for cats who are sick. But the rest of our team, the other half of our team, and a bunch of volunteers went to New York City's shelters and put portals in all their cages. So we wanted to set them up. And we'll talk a little bit about setting them up to not have this happen again as much as we can avoid it. So you've heard a couple times this week, I think, about a perfect storm. And this was definitely a perfect storm. The shelter was beyond capacity at that point in time. They had 631 cats when this started. Wow. And a lot of dogs. They were beyond their capacity, both in space and in resources in terms of ability to care. It's really hard to work in an environment when you're constantly crowded. Your staff is really burdened and compassion fatigue is real. And their community has really high expectations of them. It's a really challenging environment to work in. But boy, we cannot be more proud. I mean, truly, for a shelter to take advantage of a terrible, terrible situation like this and really use it as a jumping off point to make amazing changes. So we portalized all their cages. We went and we helped. Their staff helped as well. We had volunteers help. And I was just there 2 weeks ago. Their portals are open. They are truly actually managing their population every single day. They have a phone call every day, and they talk about what space they have. They have started fast tracking, so they move highly adoptable animals through as quickly as possible. They do open selection, which means stray animals are viewable by the public and can go home on the day that their stray hold is up. They're managing their intake. This is amazing. They are managing their intake. When they are at capacity, they are telling people who are bringing their pet to them, we are full. Can you hold on to them a little longer? It is truly incredible. People who are bringing their pets to you usually really want the best thing for them. And if you tell them, can you hang on to them a little longer? Because we know what happens if we don't. We know what happens if we get too full. They have done so much. They have really continued to build on this momentum. And now is the time where you think they'd be relaxing. But I will tell you, it's going there in August. It was amazing because this is the hardest time of year. And this was January that they had so many cats. So normally in the US in January you have fewer cats. So they have made amazing, amazing changes. These slides are from Dr. Brennan from New York City, by the way, who still is with her job after her 3-week introduction to this, New York Times story event. She is stuck with it and really impressed. They have fewer cats. They have a lot less disease. It's a lot less stressful for their staff to take care of the cats. Things like double-sided housing, the reason why we help send a team to Portalize is that is one key way to stop things from spreading in your shelter, is have enough space and have the ability to do proper disinfection in the minimal way that we need to. The other 2 shelters that I mentioned in New York that did have cats that they had transferred and had influenza didn't have spread in their shelter in the same way. So it didn't go through everybody. And that has to do some with the practices and capacity. So I think it really showed us some comparison of when you're beyond capacity, what can happen. And when you're within capacity, something like this could even potentially walk in and you may not know it and you resolve it without it spreading. So when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. And I think they really did. They did a great job. And we're so proud to be a part of it, and we're so proud of everything they've done so far, and we're really happy to not have cats have a new disease. And a huge thank you to Dr. Newberry. Truly, if she hadn't anticipated and asked Maddies for offering the money to do it, we wouldn't have been able to learn these lessons. We learned so much from this opportunity. The shelter took advantage of it and really has run with it. And I'm fortunate to have been a part of it, and I hope none of us will ever have to see this again. That would be our goal. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope your attention.